The richest man in the room was also the loneliest. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by hundreds of guests and millions of dollars in luxury, billionaire Richard Whitmore was silently falling apart. The Whitmore estate shimmered beneath the golden glow of a late summer evening. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 3 stories high. Imported marble reflected warm light across the ballroom floor. Luxury sedans and black SUVs lined the circular driveway outside like a private motor show. Inside, laughter floated through the air as politicians, celebrities, investors, and executives gathered to celebrate one of the most successful men in America. A 7-foot birthday cake stood at the center of the room beneath a canopy of white roses. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Everywhere Richard looked, people were smiling. Everywhere he turned, someone wanted to shake his hand. Happy birthday, Richard. 70 never looked so good. What an incredible celebration. The compliments came one after another. Smooth, polished, predictable. Richard smiled politely and thanked each guest. He knew exactly what was expected of him. For decades, he had mastered the art of appearing strong. But tonight, every smile felt heavier than the last. 3 years had passed since Eleanor, his wife of 42 years, had left this world. The mansion had remained the same. The wealth had remained the same. The business empire had continued to grow. Yet somehow everything that truly mattered had disappeared with her. Eleanor had never cared about headlines or stock prices. She remembered the little things. His favorite dessert. The stories he told too many times. The way he always forgot where he left his reading glasses. She had made every birthday feel like home. Now birthdays felt like reminders. Across the ballroom, Richard noticed his son speaking with venture capitalists. His daughter stood nearby, discussing a real estate acquisition with several investors. They were successful, intelligent, and respected. He felt proud of them, but throughout the evening, neither had. Spent more than a few minutes at his side. Everyone admired the billionaire. Very few noticed the father. As the celebration continued, Richard found himself staring at an empty chair near the head table. No one else would have understood its significance. Eleanor always sat there, every year, without fail. For a moment, the music faded into the background. The conversations blurred together. The room suddenly felt much larger than before, and far colder. Richard quietly set down his champagne glass and slipped away from the ballroom. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. The party continued without interruption. Through a long hallway lined with family photographs, he walked toward his private study. He closed the door behind him and crossed the room to the large window overlooking the city skyline. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness below. Families were gathering for dinner. Friends were laughing together. Children were blowing out birthday candles somewhere in homes far smaller than his. Richard lowered himself into a leather chair and stared at a framed photograph resting on his desk. Eleanor's smile looked exactly as he remembered it. Warm, gentle, real. The tears came before he could stop them. For the first time that night, the mask disappeared. The billionaire was gone. Only a lonely old man remained. He sat there in silence, grieving not for the wealth he never needed, but for the love he could never replace. Money can fill a mansion, but it cannot fill an empty heart. The people who matter most are often worth more than everything money can buy. And while the entire mansion celebrated the billionaire, one little girl was the only person who noticed he was hurting. Everyone saw the billionaire. Only one little girl saw the lonely man behind the fortune. But what happened next would begin with a simple act of kindness from a little girl and end up changing a billionaire's life forever. Richard quickly wiped his eyes and straightened his posture as he heard a faint sound outside the study door. At first he assumed it was one of the staff members checking on him. Perhaps someone had noticed his absence from the ballroom. Perhaps his assistant was looking for him. But the sound that followed was not the careful knock of an employee. It was softer, smaller, almost hesitant. The study door had not fully closed. Through the narrow opening, a pair of curious eyes quietly peeked inside. Richard turned his head. Standing in the hallway was a young girl holding a sketchbook against her chest. She immediately froze when their eyes met. For a second, neither of them spoke. The mansion suddenly felt strangely silent. Emily had been sitting near the service hallway for most of the evening while her mother worked. She had watched guests arrive in expensive suits and elegant dresses. She had listened to endless conversations about money, investments, and business deals. Yet none of those things had interested her very much. What captured her attention was something else entirely. She had noticed the way Richard's smile disappeared whenever people looked away. She had noticed him staring at the empty chair near the head table. Most importantly, she had noticed him leaving the ballroom alone. Children often see what adults overlook. Richard cleared his throat and attempted a reassuring smile. "You should probably be at the party," he said gently. Emily looked down at the sketchbook in her hands before gathering enough courage to answer. "I did not think you wanted to be at the party." The honesty caught him completely off guard. For a moment, Richard did not know what to say. Most people spent their lives carefully choosing words around him. They measured every sentence. They protected his feelings or sought his approval. But Emily simply told the truth. The girl slowly stepped into the study. Behind her, the distant sounds of music and celebration drifted through the mansion. The contrast felt almost unreal. One room overflowed with guests. The other held a lonely man and a child who barely knew him. Emily glanced toward the photograph on the desk. "Is it your wife?" she asked quietly. Richard looked at the frame. His expression softened immediately. "Yes," he answered. "Her name was Eleanor." Emily studied the photograph for several seconds. "She looks kind." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. Of all the comments people had made about Eleanor over the years, that was the one she would have loved most. Not beautiful, not elegant, not impressive. Kind. She was, he said softly. Emily nodded, as if confirming something important. Then she looked back at Richard. "I think she would not want you to be sad on your birthday." The words settled into the room with surprising weight. Richard stared at the young girl, unaware that the sketchbook she held contained something that was about to touch his heart in a way no amount of money ever could. Richard had spent decades receiving expensive gifts, but nothing could have prepared him for what Emily was about to show him. The study remained quiet as the little girl tightened her grip on the sketchbook. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether she should continue. Then, gathering her courage, she stepped closer to the desk. Richard watched curiously. There was something remarkably sincere about her presence. She was not impressed by the mansion. She was not intimidated by his wealth. She simply seemed concerned. Emily carefully opened the sketchbook and turned it around so he could see. "I drew this earlier," she said softly. Richard lowered his eyes toward the page. His breath caught. It was a drawing of a family gathered around a dining table. The artwork was simple, created with colored pencils and the imagination of a 10-year-old girl. Yet every detail carried warmth. Sunlight streamed through windows. Smiling faces surrounded the table. In the center sat an older man. Emily had drawn him wearing a blue sweater instead of a business suit. Beside him sat a woman with silver hair. Around them were children, grandchildren, and even a golden retriever sleeping beneath the table. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked connected. Richard stared silently at the picture. "That is supposed to be you," Emily explained. "And that is your wife." Richard's eyes lingered on the smiling figure beside him. For a second, he could almost hear Eleanor's laugh again. "It is beautiful," he whispered. Emily smiled. "I know she's not here anymore. My grandma went to heaven too." Richard looked up. This was the first time Emily had mentioned her own family. "You miss her?" he asked gently. Emily nodded. "Every day." The answer came quickly, without hesitation. Children often speak about grief with a kind of honesty adults lose over time. "Sometimes I still talk to her when I'm scared," Emily continued. "My mom says people we love never completely leave us. They stay inside our hearts." Richard felt something shift inside him. Not because the words were complicated. They were not. In fact, they were incredibly simple. But sometimes the simplest truths arrive exactly when they are needed most. For years, Richard had buried himself in work. Whenever loneliness appeared, he answered emails. Whenever sadness surfaced, he attended meetings. Whenever memories hurt, he distracted himself with business. Yet this child was reminding him of something he had forgotten. Love does not disappear simply because someone is gone. Emily reached into the back of the sketchbook and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "There is something else," she said. Richard unfolded it carefully. Across the page, written in slightly uneven handwriting, was a birthday message. It read, "Dear Mr. Whitmore, I hope you smile today because somebody who loved you would want that. Happy birthday." For several seconds, Richard could not speak. Out of all the gifts he had received that evening, this was the only one that asked for nothing in return. No favor. No business opportunity. No recognition. Just kindness. Pure and simple. And as Richard looked at the handwritten note resting in his hands, he had no idea that someone else had just witnessed the entire moment from the doorway, and what that person did next would change everything. The person standing outside the study door was not a stranger. It was Maria. She had come looking for her daughter and had accidentally witnessed every word. For several seconds, she remained frozen in the hallway, unsure whether to interrupt. The sight before her was something she never expected to see. The powerful businessman whose name appeared on magazine covers around the country was sitting quietly at his desk, listening to a 10-year-old girl as though her words mattered more than any boardroom presentation. Maria gently knocked on the door. Emily turned around immediately. "Mom." Relief washed over Maria's face as she stepped inside. "There you are. I have been looking everywhere for you." Then she glanced at Richard and immediately became uncomfortable. "I am so sorry, sir. I hope she was not bothering you." Before Emily could answer, Richard surprised both of them. "Not at all," he said warmly. "Actually, she's been the best part of my evening." Maria blinked. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. Richard carefully folded the handwritten note and placed it beside Eleanor's photograph. Then he picked up the drawing once more. "Did she really make this herself?" he asked. Maria smiled proudly. "She has loved drawing since she was little. We cannot afford many art supplies, but she fills every notebook she can find." Richard studied the picture again. Suddenly, something caught his attention. In the corner of the page, Emily had drawn a small yellow house surrounded by flowers. It looked very different from a mansion around them. "Is this your home?" Richard asked. Emily nodded enthusiastically. "That is our apartment. It is small, but Mom lets me paint pictures on the refrigerator." Richard found himself smiling. It was the first genuine smile he had felt all day. The conversation continued for several more minutes. Unlike the formal exchanges he experienced every day, this one felt effortless. Emily talked about school, her favorite books, and her dream of becoming an artist. Maria occasionally apologized for her daughter's honesty, but Richard found himself appreciating it more with every passing minute. Then something happened that neither Emily nor Maria noticed. Richard looked at the clock on the wall. The birthday party was still going on downstairs. Hundreds of guests were waiting. Yet for the first time all evening, he had completely forgotten about them. The realization startled him. The grand celebration that had seemed so important hours earlier suddenly felt distant and unimportant. Here, inside a quiet study, he had found something the ballroom could not offer: authentic connection. As the evening grew, later, Maria finally told Emily it was time to leave. Emily carefully closed her sketchbook and prepared to go. Before reaching the door, however, she turned back toward Richard. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Richard nodded. "Of course." Emily hesitated. Then she asked a question no adult had dared ask him in years. A question so simple and unexpected that it would leave him speechless. "When was the last time you were truly happy?" Richard stared at her, unable to answer, and the memory that suddenly entered his mind would change everything that happened next. For several minutes after Emily asked her question, Richard said nothing. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly through the walls, but it felt impossibly far away. The celebration continued without him. The laughter, the conversations, the carefully planned birthday party, none of it seemed real anymore. One simple question had somehow cut through years of noise. When was the last time you were truly happy? Richard stared at the drawing in his hands. Part of him wanted to dismiss the question entirely. What could a 10-year-old girl possibly understand about loss, responsibility, and the weight of an empire built over decades? Children saw the world differently. Simpler. Easier. They did not understand sacrifice. They did not understand grief. Yet the longer he sat there, the harder it became to ignore the truth. Emily had not asked about his company. She had not asked about money. She had not asked about success. She had asked about happiness. And deep down, Richard realized something uncomfortable. He had spent years avoiding that question himself. The room grew quieter as memories slowly surfaced. At first, they came in fragments. A summer breeze. All wood and duck. The sound of Eleanor laughing somewhere nearby. Then the images became clearer. Richard found himself remembering a small lake house in northern Michigan nearly 20 years earlier. Back then, life had felt different. The company was growing, but it had not yet consumed every corner of his existence. He remembered waking before sunrise with Eleanor beside him. He remembered sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee while mist drifted across the water. He remembered his children running barefoot through the grass, racing toward the lake without a single concern in the world. No one talked about quarterly earnings. No one discussed acquisitions. No one needed anything from him except his presence. For a moment, Richard could almost hear their voices again. The memory hit him with surprising force. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf nearby. Eleanor smiled back at him from another lifetime. Suddenly, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. Not because he was alone, but because he understood how he had become alone. It had not happened overnight. It had happened one missed dinner at a time, one postponed vacation, one canceled family gathering, one promise to spend more time together after the next deal was finished. Then another deal came, and another after that. Years disappeared. Emily remained quiet, sensing something important was happening. Finally, Richard spoke. His voice was softer than before. I think it was at our lake house. With my family. Emily smiled. Then that sounds like the answer. Richard gave a small laugh. Maybe it is. What made it so special? She asked. He looked down at the drawing again. The answer arrived instantly. The people, he said. Just being with the people I loved. Emily nodded as if the answer were obvious. To a child, perhaps it was. But to Richard, it felt like a revelation. For years, he had been measuring his life by accomplishments while quietly starving the relationships that mattered most. The realization hurt. It also brought something unexpected. Hope. Because if loneliness had been created one choice at a time, perhaps it could be repaired the same way. Emily carefully closed her sketchbook and stood up. Maria appeared at the doorway a few moments later, reminding her that it was getting late. Before leaving, Emily turned back one last time. I hope next year's birthday feels happier. Richard smiled. A genuine smile this time. I hope so too. After they left, Richard remained alone in the study. But the loneliness felt different now. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what might still be possible. And before the night was over, he would make a decision that could change far more than his next birthday. The decision Richard made that night felt simple when he was alone in the study. The next morning, it felt much harder. For years, he had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. He had made decisions that affected thousands of employees. Yet as he sat at his desk staring at his phone, his hand remained still. Calling his children suddenly felt more intimidating than any boardroom he had ever entered. The reason was painfully simple. Business problems came with solutions. Family wounds came with history. Richard picked up the phone and stared at his son's number for several seconds before finally pressing call. The line rang twice. Dad, his son answered. Richard immediately recognized the cautious tone. It was polite, respectful, but distant. Good morning, Richard replied. I hope I am not interrupting anything. No, everything is fine. Another brief silence followed. Then came the question Richard had expected. Is this about the company? The words landed harder than his son intended. Richard realized that after years of conversations centered on business, his son could no longer imagine another reason for the call. No, Richard answered quietly. It is not about the company. More silence. The kind of silence that only exists between people who once loved each other deeply, but gradually stopped knowing how to talk to one another. Finally, his son spoke again. "Then what is it about?" Richard looked toward the family photograph sitting on his desk. "I was wondering if you would like to have lunch with me this weekend." "Just lunch. No business. No meetings." His son did not answer immediately. Richard could almost hear him processing the invitation. "Sure," he finally said. "I think I can do that." The conversation ended politely, but Richard sat motionless for several moments afterward. It was not the enthusiastic response he secretly hoped for. It was a beginning. Later that morning, he called his daughter. The conversation unfolded almost exactly the same way. Surprise, caution, uncertainty, years of emotional distance could not disappear with a single phone call. Still, she agreed to meet him. When the call ended, Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time, he fully understood the cost of the choices he had made over the years. Success had given him nearly everything he thought he wanted. Yet rebuilding trust with the people he loved would require something money could never buy. Time, patience, consistency. Across town, Maria was beginning another workday, while Emily sat at the kitchen table drawing before school. The apartment was small, but carried a warmth Richard's enormous mansion often lacked. Emily looked up from her sketchbook. "Do you think Mr. Whitmore is happier today?" she asked. Maria smiled. "Why do you ask?" Emily shrugged. "Because yesterday he looked like somebody trying to find his way home." Maria paused. The description was surprisingly accurate. Later that afternoon, while reviewing paperwork in his office, Richard found himself opening Emily's birthday card once again. He read the simple message several times. Then his attention shifted toward a small drawing tucked inside the card. In that moment, an idea began taking shape. It was not about business. It was not about profit. It was about possibility. And before the day was over, Richard would learn something about Emily's biggest dream that would change far more lives than either of them could imagine. The secret Richard discovered that afternoon was far simpler than he expected, yet it touched him more deeply than any business crisis he had ever faced. It happened during conversation with Maria later that day. She had returned to the estate for her regular shift, unaware that Richard had specifically asked to speak with her before she started work. Maria entered his office nervously. Employees rarely received personal invitations from the owner himself. Richard welcomed her warmly and offered her a seat. At first, the conversation was ordinary. He thanked her for raising such a thoughtful daughter. Maria smiled politely, clearly embarrassed by the attention. Then Richard asked a simple question. "Emily mentioned she loves art. Has she always wanted to become an artist?" Maria's expression changed immediately. Pride appeared first, then sadness followed. "Since she was 5 years old," she answered softly. "Drawing is her favorite thing in the world." Richard leaned forward with interest. "Have you ever enrolled her in professional classes?" Maria hesitated before responding. "I looked into it once. There is an excellent youth arts program across town." She forced a smile. "But it costs more than I can manage right now." Richard nodded quietly. The answer was not surprising. Yet what Maria said next stayed with him. "Emily knows we cannot afford it." So she stopped asking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Richard glanced toward the sketchbook resting on a nearby table. A child with extraordinary talent had already learned how to lower her expectations to protect her mother from feeling guilty. The thought broke his heart. Later that evening, after Maria finished her shift, she returned home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table drawing beneath a small lamp. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of pencils moving across paper. "What are you working on?" Maria asked. Emily smiled. "A picture of the lake house Mr. Whitmore told me about." Maria laughed softly. Somehow, even a brief conversation had left an impression on her daughter. Neither of them knew that, at that exact moment, Richard was sitting alone in his office reviewing information about the arts program Maria had mentioned. He studied the curriculum, the instructors, and the student portfolios. The more he read, the more convinced he became. Emily belonged there. But he also knew something important. Charity given carelessly can sometimes wound a person's dignity. Maria had worked hard her entire life. He did not want her to feel pitied. He wanted her to feel respected. The next morning, Richard arrived at the estate carrying a large envelope. Inside was something that had taken him most of the night to arrange. It was not merely tuition assistance. It was an opportunity that could open doors for years to come. As he walked toward the staff offices, he felt a sense of purpose he had not experienced in a very long time. Yet before he could present the envelope, an unexpected visitor arrived at the mansion. The visitor carried news that would complicate everything and force Richard to make an even bigger decision than the one he had planned. The unexpected visitor was Richard's attorney, Samuel Green, a man who had worked alongside him for nearly 2 decades. The moment Samuel entered the office, Richard could tell something was unusual. Samuel was carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that balanced concern with urgency. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," Samuel said, "but I thought you should hear this in person." Richard set the envelope intended for Maria aside and listened carefully. What Samuel revealed had nothing to do with business competition or financial markets. Instead, it involved the Whitmore Family Foundation, a charitable organization Eleanor had helped create years earlier. According to Samuel, the foundation's youth scholarship division had quietly accumulated millions of dollars that were sitting unused because several planned programs had been delayed. Richard frowned. Eleanor had always believed that opportunities should reach children before circumstances convinced them to stop dreaming. Hearing that resources were sitting untouched felt wrong. Samuel opened the folder and showed him several reports. As Richard reviewed the documents, one sentence immediately caught his attention. The foundation was actively searching for a new flagship program to support talented children from hardworking families with limited financial means. Suddenly, Emily's face appeared in his mind. Her sketchbook, her kindness, her quiet decision to stop asking for help because she knew her mother could not afford it. The coincidence felt almost impossible. Yet Richard knew better than to ignore moments that seemed meaningful. That afternoon, he requested a special meeting with the foundation's board members. The proposal shocked everyone in the room. Instead of funding another large publicity campaign, Richard wanted to create a national arts scholarship program in Eleanor's memory. A program designed specifically for gifted children whose families sacrificed everything for their futures. Some board members questioned the idea. Others worried it would receive less media attention than larger projects. But Richard remained firm. For the first time in years, he was not making a decision based on public perception. He was making one based on purpose. By evening, the proposal was unanimously approved. Meanwhile, Maria finished her shift and prepared to leave the estate. She had no idea that her life was about to change. Richard stopped her near the staff entrance and handed her the large envelope. Confused, Maria looked down at it. Inside, she found information about the Arts Academy, a full scholarship opportunity, and a personal letter. Her hands trembled as she read. The scholarship covered tuition, supplies, transportation, and mentorship. Every obstacle she had worried about was addressed. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "I cannot accept this," she whispered. Richard smiled gently. "You are not accepting charity. Emily earned an opportunity. There is a difference." For several seconds, Maria could not speak. Years of sacrifice, worry, and sleepless nights suddenly felt seen. Yet before she could fully process what was happening, Richard revealed one final surprise. Emily was not the only child who would benefit. The new program would help hundreds of young artists across the country pursue dreams they thought were impossible. And when Emily learned the truth about why the program existed, she would discover something even more remarkable than the scholarship itself. 1 year later, the room was filled with applause, but Richard Whitmore barely heard it. As he stood backstage at the inaugural Eleanor Whitmore Arts Initiative Gala, his attention remained fixed on a young girl waiting near the front row with a sketchbook resting against her chest. Emily looked taller now, more confident, more certain of her place in the world. Yet her smile was exactly the same smile that had quietly changed the course of his life 12 months earlier. What began as a single scholarship had grown into something nobody expected. Over the past year, hundreds of talented children from across the country had received opportunities through the program. Some came from small farming towns. Others came from crowded city neighborhoods. Many had spent years believing their dreams were simply too expensive. Now their artwork filled galleries, classrooms, and community centers. Their families filled the audience that evening. Parents sat beside children whose futures looked brighter than ever before. As the ceremony continued, several scholarship recipients shared their stories. The audience laughed. They cried. They applauded. Yet the most important moment of the night was still waiting. Finally, Richard's name was announced. The room rose to its feet. A standing ovation echoed throughout the ballroom. Richard slowly approached the podium. For a moment, he simply looked out across the crowd. Then he began to speak. Many people believe this program started with money. The room grew quiet. They believe it started with a foundation, a board meeting, or a financial decision. He paused, but they are wrong. Complete silence filled the ballroom. Richard looked directly toward Emily. This program began because a little girl noticed a lonely old man. Several people glanced toward Emily. Her eyes widened with surprise. Richard continued. 1 year ago, on my birthday, that little girl asked me a question nobody else had asked in years. His voice softened. She asked me when I was truly happy. Across the room, Maria lowered her head as tears filled her eyes. Richard smiled gently. I spent most of my life building companies. I believe success was measured by growth, influence, and achievement. He paused again. But a child taught me something wealth never could. The audience sat perfectly still. The most valuable thing we can give another person is not money. His eyes drifted across the room. It is making them feel seen. A few quiet tears appeared throughout the audience. Richard turned toward Emily once more. You reminded me that kindness matters. You reminded me that family matters. And you reminded me that happiness is not found in what we own. It is found in who we share our lives with. The room erupted into applause. Emily could no longer hold back her tears. Neither could Maria. Moments later, Richard invited Emily onto the stage. The audience stood again as she slowly walked forward carrying her sketchbook. Richard knelt beside her and smiled. Thank you, he whispered. Emily opened her sketchbook and handed him a drawing. The picture showed a large table surrounded by families, children, artists, and friends. No one sat alone. Across the top, she had written 4 simple words. Everyone deserves a place. Richard felt his throat tighten, because for the first time in many years, he finally understood what Eleanor had always known. A meaningful life is not measured by how much a person accumulates. It is measured by how many lives they touch. Later that evening, Richard returned home surrounded by his children, his grandchildren, old friends, and a little girl carrying a sketchbook. The mansion was quieter than it had been a year before. The guest list was smaller. The decorations were simpler. Yet the house felt fuller than it ever had, because happiness had never been hiding in the rooms he built. It had been waiting in the hearts he almost forgot to cherish. And on the birthday that once felt empty, Richard finally received the greatest gift of all. Not success, not wealth, not recognition, but a second chance to love, to connect, and to truly belong. Dưới đây là nội dung bằng tiếng Anh Mỹ, phù hợp để đọc cuối video hoặc ghim bình luận YouTube. This story tauchet me deeply bekait zemin us ta suset, wow, and zekogitino min vedi lito ipwi ne let te people vedupto juli lup us. One of the most powerful lessons I took from this story is that kindness can come from the most unexpected places and often has the power to change lives forever. Emily's compassion showed that being seen, heard, and valued is one of the greatest gifts we can offer another human being. In our busy lives, we often chase achievements while forgetting to nurture our relationships. This story encourages us to spend more time with family, appreciate the people who care about us, and never underestimate the impact of a simple act of kindness. True happiness is not found in what we own, but in the connections we build, the love we share, and the lives we touch along the way. When we choose empathy over indifference, we create a better world not only for others but also for ourselves. As the author of this content, I believe this story carries a timeless message that many of us need to hear today. It reminded me that loneliness can exist even behind success, and that every person is fighting battles we may never see. I was especially moved by how a young girl noticed what hundreds of adults overlooked. Her kindness proved that wisdom is not measured by age, status, or wealth. This story made me reflect on the importance of being present for the people we love before it's too late. It also reminded me that small actions often create the biggest changes. A sincere conversation, a thoughtful gesture, or a few kind words can alter the direction of someone's life. I believe we should never become so busy that we forget to care. We should never assume people know they are loved without hearing it from us. Most importantly, I believe a meaningful life is measured not by what we accumulate, but by how many hearts we help along the way. That is the lesson I will carry with me long after this story ends. Educational statement. This story is intended for educational and inspirational purposes, encouraging reflection on kindness, family values, empathy, gratitude, and the importance of human connection in everyday life. Disclaimer. This story contains some creative elements and AI-assisted content created to provide engaging entertainment while sharing meaningful, uplifting, and inspiring life lessons. Names, events, situations, and certain details may be dramatized, adapted, or fictionalized for storytelling purposes. The primary goal is to inspire positive values, personal growth, compassion, and thoughtful reflection among viewers and listeners.